Came home from my last Navy deployment, expecting chowder and hugs. By nightfall, my mother told me to find my own place. I'm Harris Lindell, 48. A structural engineer, still smelling of salt air, the cool weight of my father's old pocket watch in my hand. Ever had a welcome home turn into an eviction notice before dessert? The gulls found me first. Their cries skated over the harbor and into the narrow street, where our clapboard house leaned into the wind, as if listening. I came up the steps with my duffel biting my shoulder salt drying on my sleeves, and the bell out on the breakwater bonged once like a punctuation mark I hadn't earned yet. Inside, the air was thick with chowder and cinnamon. My mother moved between stove and table with a hostess smile that fit her like an old brooch, bright for guests, dimmer when it caught me. My father hovered near the window the way he does when a storm might change its mind. Faye kissed my cheek and held on a second too long, then stepped back as if bracing for a loud noise. Calder spread his arms like the owner of the evening. "Now there's a sight, Rockport's favorite engineer," he said, clapping my shoulder hard enough to rattle bone. "You picked a good time to get back, Harris. Harborfront's about to have its day. Prime property." He rolled the word prime like a mint. I set my duffel by the radiator and took the lemonade my mother pressed into my hand. Condensation slid down the glass and onto my knuckles. I could feel the chill long after I'd swallowed. The room filled and emptied with cousins and neighbors. There were questions about heat and sand and the way time bends overseas. I answered in short lines, the kind you can fold up and put in a pocket. My father nodded at the floor. My mother laughed a beat late at Calder's stories. When the plates came out, pie the color of late blueberries, I reached into my jacket and touched the small, hard circle I'd carried across oceans. The metal had taken the shape of my palm over months. It was cool now only because the lemonade had been. I stood and cleared my throat. "I brought something back," I said, and the table quieted. My mother's eyes searched my face the way they used to search the shoreline for my father's boat, counting seconds between swells. I set the pocket watch in her hand. The lid clicked open with a tired dignity. Inside, the hairline scratches caught the kitchen light like a faint constellation. "It was Dad's," I said. "I kept time with it when the generators were down. It sounded like home over there." Her fingers thin as book ribbons curled around it. For a moment she forgot the room and its watchers. The smile that lived in old photographs surfaced and softened everything. "Your grandfather's," she murmured, correcting me. "Your father only borrowed it." She glanced up at Ewan. He met the watch with his eyes instead of mine, and I pretended not to notice. Calder leaned in, admiring the shine. "Antiques have a way of appreciating." "In the right location," he said, as if the watch had asked for a realtor. "Same with houses near the wharf." Timing, timing, timing. The bell out on the breakwater spoke again. People left in twos and threes. The last cousin hugged me and promised to stop by the job site I didn't have yet. The chowder pot sighed. My mother dried the same plate 3 times before setting it down. She wiped her hands on a towel and looked at me with the practiced kindness of someone who has rehearsed a difficult line. "Walk with me a moment," she said. We stepped onto the porch. Evening pressed cool fingers into the street. Hydrangeas nodded under a slow wind. Through the screen door I could still hear the clink of cutlery and Calder's laugh lazily rattling the cabinets. "We've been talking," my mother began, her voice carefully level. "Your father and I. The house is too much now. Your sister and Calder have plans. It's time we think about selling, and it's best if you find your own place for a while. Just until things are settled." I looked past her to the harbor where the moorings bobbed like punctuation marks again. I could have asked when, why, how soon, but every question would only give weight to an answer already heavy. The watch lay against my ribs, small and stubborn. "Sure," I said. "I can manage." Her relief showed in the way she exhaled, quiet, guilty, grateful. "You're good at managing," she said, and touched my arm as if that could make the sentence kind. Behind us, the kitchen light shifted. Calder's voice slipped through the screen in a lower register, the one he used for deals. "Once he's settled somewhere else, we can move quickly on the paperwork," he told my father. Paperwork. The word landed like a nail tapped home. "Thank you for dinner," I told my mother, "because you don't fight the tide on the porch. You watch it. You learn its rhythm. You decide where to place the rocks." She nodded, and the hostess' smile returned, smaller. Now meant for one person. "There's pie in the fridge," she said, which in our family could mean, "I'm sorry," or "We don't have to talk about this." She eased the door open, slipped inside, and the spring pulled it after her. The latch clicked. I stayed where the boards give a little under the third step, listening to the bell, to the breath of the sea, finding its way between houses. The porch light caught a silver thread of water running down my glass. It slid across my fingers and disappeared between the planks. Somewhere above the roofline, a gull wheeled and shouted like it had the last word. The lock turned. The house settled. I stood with my duffel and the watch looking at the dark line where street meets harbor and let the night say what needed saying. By morning, the street smelled like wet rope and hydrangeas, and the gulls were already quarreling over something invisible. That was when I saw it, a red and white for sale sign staked into the scorched patch of lawn next door to my parents' house. The arrow pointed at the white-painted Victorian, whose shutters peeled in long curls like sunburnt skin. I stood there, coffee cooling in a paper cup, and felt the day tilt. The front gate complained when I pushed through. A woman in a navy blazer appeared on the porch, as if she'd been waiting for the creak. "You must be Harris," she said, brisk and pleasant, glancing just once past my shoulder toward my parents' windows. "I'm Ruth with Penobscot Realty. We're showing this one today." Inside, dust motes hung in a shaft of light like a slow constellation. The house had that old coast smell, salt worked into wood, a hint of coal from winters I only knew in family stories. I pressed my palm to a plaster wall and felt the stubborn cool of lath and horsehair beneath it. The parlor's floorboards gave a soft groan under my weight. Not a protest, more like a greeting. Through the arch, the dining room opened toward a bay window, with rippled glass that made the harbor wobble as if the sea itself were nervous. "Bones are good," I said, mostly to myself. On the porch, a lanky guy in work boots crouched under a column, tapping the base with the back of a screwdriver. He glanced up, hair in his eyes. "Jonas Markham," he said. "I'm looking at porch loads for a potential client." His gaze flicked to my hand where I'd unconsciously started tracing the line of the beam pocket. "You're in the trade structural," I said. "Or was. I can still read a joist when it talks." He grinned. "Then you hear what I hear. Sills tired but not rotten, columns out a 1/4 inch from plumb. Fixable with jacks and patience." We traded a few easy measurements and the kind of jokes only people who like lumber make. On the stairs, I paused to listen. The stringer chirped once, high and hopeful. Upstairs, a narrow bedroom faced my parents' side yard, where my mother's hydrangeas bowed under bees. The sight reached into me like a hand I hadn't expected. Back in the kitchen, Ruth cleared her throat gently. "Full disclosure, we have a motivated buyer already," she said, paperwork balanced on her forearm. "Offers conditional." The last word floated out with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Another small glance toward my parents' house, as if the clapboards could eavesdrop. "Financing and zoning," I asked. She didn't answer directly. Realtors never do. Rockport's particular about harbor access, which meant yes on both counts. I pictured Calder's salesman grin and the way he rolled the word prime around his mouth last night. Jonas leaned against the door jamb. This place could be something, he said, looking past Ruth's forms to the room itself. Open the kitchen brace, the porch, refinish the heart pine, she'd sing again. I walked the perimeter slow, counting under my breath, finding the rhythm of studs behind the plaster. In the parlor, the afternoon lit the crown molding and a constellation of hairline cracks. None of them bothered me. The worst problems in a house were the ones you couldn't see. Here the truth was right there in the grain-time neglect, and a willingness to be made right if someone would bother. Ruth named a number. I ran it against the mental ledger I carry, the way other people carry worry beads. Mortgage math has its own weather. Sometimes it blows in hard and leaves you drenched. Sometimes the sky opens. Today it felt like fog clearing just enough to see the channel markers. From the front steps, the view lined up perfectly, my parents' roofline to the left, the bell on the breakwater straight ahead. Close enough to carry a casserole across the grass, in a storm far enough to let everyone breathe. Independence measured in feet, not miles, and something else, the quiet satisfaction of placing a rock in the tide and watching the current split. I'd like a copy of the disclosures, I said. Ruth handed them over. The pages whispered. If you want to talk numbers, we can meet this afternoon. I'll be in touch, I said. Jonas gave me a small nod that felt like the beginning of a handshake we hadn't had yet. Outside, the hydrangeas shook their blue heads as if they were allowed an opinion. I walked back toward downtown with the packet under my arm. The paper was warm from the sun by the time I pushed open the door to my rented room above the bait shop. The place smelled like coffee and ocean, and something faintly metallic that never leaves old buildings. I set the packet on the desk and slid open the drawer where I'd been pretending I didn't keep a plan. Military savings statements lay stacked with the precision of a barracks inspection. Under them, an old loan application I'd started years ago and never sent. I laid both on top of the disclosures, lined their corners together until the edges matched, and sat very still while the floor hummed with the harbor's low machinery. Celeste's bell is one of those old ship bells that sounds a little too big for the door. It clangs my arrival into the room like an announcement from the harbor. The shop smells of lemon oil and mint tea, a tidy brightness fighting the sweet dust of years. Brass lamps crowd the front table, their stems catching the window light. A drawer full of sextants sits open, as if someone had stepped away mid-voyage. I've known Celeste Rowan since I was a kid stacking bait boxes on the pier. She has a contractor's hands and a librarian's memory, which is to say she remembers the names on permits and the birthdays of the people who signed them. You look like a question, she says, pouring tea before I even ask. I saw the sign next door, I say. I need to know what I'm buying into history. Headaches, the fine print nobody frames. She gestures me toward a little table between rolled nautical charts. 40 years on this street, she says, and that house has only been sold twice. Built in 1893 by Asa Pike, a cooper who thought barrels would outlast boats. She taps a fingertip on a faded survey map. This lot carries grandfathered docking rights from when the lane ran all the way to the water. The town clipped it in the 30s. The right stayed. It's worth more than the porch and paint. I bend over the map. The paper has that brittle onion skin sound. Inked lines quiver like nerves. So access is buried in the deed, I say. That explains the sudden enthusiasm. Celeste's eyes sharpen. Whose enthusiasm she knows, but she wants to hear the name in my mouth. Calder Finn, I say, and the brass around us seems to cool a degree. She snorts, a small boat bumping the dock. His charter outfit's been bleeding since last fall. 2 engines rebuilt, 1 bad loan, and tourists thin as gulls in January. He needs collateral that looks like land. You're between him and a bank manager's handshake. I reach into my folder and slide a printed email across the table. The black and white of it makes the room feel more official. The subject line reads, "Offer conditional," and the timestamp is late, well after my mother turned off the porch light last night. Ruth's polite phrases sit there like folded napkins. Beneath them is the meat financing, not final zoning uncertainty, flagged seller open to stronger terms. Celeste scans it, lips pursed. Conditional, she repeats, savoring the syllables, which means nothing until it means everything. A couple wanders the aisles, pretending to look at glass buoys and actually listening. Celeste raises her voice a notch for their benefit. "Funny thing about rezoning," she says. "The council meets next month to talk harborfront adjustments. Some folks want broader setbacks and parking minimums. Others just want favors with better names." I take my tea mint, cutting through the lemon oil like clean weather after fog. If that deed holds docking rights, setbacks won't matter. Not if you assert them before someone redraws the map to make you a courtesy, she says. Then softer. "You always were polite, Harris. Don't be polite on paper." We talk through the bones of the Victorian the way some people talk through family trees. I describe the sill, the out-of-plumb column, the crown molding that might be original. She nods along every detail, another reason to care. When the couple departs, she leans in. "Listen," she says, "Calder's already put a lien on his bigger boat. He's one surprise away from missing a payment. If he adds your parents' block to his pitch, he'll look solvent long enough to make trouble." "Then I need to move first," I say. "You needed to move yesterday." She gets up, rifles the drawer behind the counter, and returns with a card. "Nate Hardigan, Property Law." He's dull as a butter knife until someone tries to get cute with clauses. Ask him about grandfathered rights and prior use. Bring him Ruth's disclosures and this. She tears a thin strip from the old survey and tucks it into an envelope like contraband. Copy only. The original lives in my safe. I fold the email, slide it back into the folder with more care than the paper deserves. The bell outside the harbor tolls once faint through the glass. Celeste watches my face as if measuring whether I can lift what I'm asking to carry. Then she leans back, eyes narrowed, the verdict landing between us like a plumb bob hitting center. "If you want that house," she says, voice dry as salt, "you'd better move before the council meets." I pay for a chipped mug I don't need, and step into the street with the envelope inside my jacket. The wind has shifted. The flags on Main are all pointing toward the water, and gulls skate the current without flapping. Across the way, Ruth stands with her clipboard angled like a shield. Calder's beside her, talking with his hands, laughter big enough to reach my side of the street. He doesn't see me, not yet. I watch his gesture carve the air around the Victorian, as if drawing plans nobody asked him to draw, and I keep walking until the bell sounds again, and my feet remember how to make a quiet turn. Faye's text said coffee. Her voice on the porch said something else. "Come in," she murmured, and stepped aside as if I were a delivery she wasn't sure she'd ordered. The cinnamon candle had been working overtime, sweet and insistent, a bakery that wouldn't take no for an answer. Her living room faced the harbor like a theater balcony. The picture window framed the water in a calm that didn't belong to the room. They were already there. My mother on the edge of the sofa, hands married in her lap. My father by the window, weight on one hip, the stance of a man who wants to be outside without making a scene. And Calder planted in the armchair nearest the coffee table, a manila folder at his elbow, fingers drumming out a tempo I didn't recognize. "Good to see you, Harris," he said, too bright. We thought it would be helpful to talk like reasonable people. Coffee, Faye said again, a little desperately, and pressed a mug into my hand. The cinnamon chased the coffee until both tastes canceled out and left heat. I sat on the far end of the sofa. The harbor bell counted once and stopped. Calder's smile arranged itself. "I'll get right to it," he said, flipping the folder open so I could see the thickness of papers without reading a word. "We've increased our offer next door. It's a generous number given the condition. Sellers are inclined. Timing is excellent. I'd hate for any complications to slow this down." My mother glanced at me, then away, a swallow in her throat. Faye stared at the candle's flame as if it could answer for her. My father kept looking through the glass at nothing in particular. "What complications?" I asked. Calder lifted a shoulder. "You know how towns are. People get attached to ideas. For the sake of family harmony, it would be wise to let this one go. There's no reason to tie yourself in knots over a pile of peeling paint. I can make sure your parents are settled well. Everyone wins." I felt for the watch in my jacket pocket, the small weight exactly where it always is. My thumb found the familiar edge and settled there. "I don't plan on knots," I said. "I plan on clear lines." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, salesman's posture. "Listen, I get it. You've just come home. Emotions run high. But property is math. It's inches and dollars. Prime is prime." Behind him, the harbor light shifted on the water, a bright strip rearranging itself. I had the odd thought that the sea could hear him and was laughing. "Math's good," I said. "It keeps people honest on paper, at least." Faye made a small sound, the beginning of a word that lost its footing. Maybe we could Calder cut her off with a glance that wore a smile like a mask. "We're offering certainty," he said. "You can't offer that. Not here, not now." My father turned from the window. "Enough," he said softly. It didn't stop anything. I stood to give my legs a job. The mug knocked the table and the saucer rattled once like a warning buoy. "I appreciate the concern," I said. "But where I live is my business." "Where you live affects all of us," Calder replied. "You parked your bag back in town, didn't you? Keep it there. We'll handle the neighborhood." Something in me wanted to laugh. Instead, I breathed. The watch shifted in my pocket as I moved just a slip, a small betrayal of fabric, and then gravity finished the thought. It slid, kissed the edge of my jacket, and dropped. The sound was modest and absolute, a bright ping against hardwood followed by the delicate clicking of the lid yawning open before the crystal found the floor. A hairline star bloomed across the glass, thin enough to deny itself undeniable all the same. Faye's hand flew to her mouth. My mother made a sound I hadn't heard since I was a kid and fell off the dock. My father closed his eyes as if taking inventory of the room's air. Calder's smile twitched, then steadied. "See," he said almost kindly, "things break. It's not a tragedy to let go." I crouched and picked the watch up. The hinge still moved, the second hand still swept its small errand. I pressed the lid closed until it clicked, and my thumb found the crack's unkind seam. It was intact and injured like most of what matters. When I stood, Calder was already arranging the next line. So he said, "We're agreed this is the best path." I met his eyes and let the room go quiet enough to hear the candle's soft hiss. "I'll be right here," I said evenly, "no matter what you do." For a moment, nobody breathed. The bell outside didn't oblige us with punctuation. Faye set her mug down too fast. Coffee splashed the saucer and climbed back into the cup like it meant to stay. My mother stared at my hands, not at my face. My father cleared his throat, but didn't speak. Calder's expression tightened at the corners before he remembered to smile again. "Stubborn isn't a strategy," he said, collecting the papers into the folder with precise taps. He stood slow enough to make it look like patience. "You'll see that this is bigger than you." Faye walked me to the door and touched my sleeve. "Please," she said, and the rest of the sentence failed her. I didn't ask which side of please she meant. The air outside was cooler, the cinnamon finally behind me. I took the steps like a man who knew how they creaked. Through the cracked window, I heard Calder's voice roll into the low register he kept for people who mattered to him more than we did. "Push the process through before year's end," he murmured, words trimmed for a phone. The harbor answered with a thin breeze that found the crack in the crystal and made it cold under my thumb. I put the watch back in my pocket and started down the walk slow enough to feel each board give and recover the way houses do when you let them. March came in off the water with teeth. The porch rail shivered under a gust, and the loose finial at the stair post clicked like a nervous tooth. Calder angled up the steps ahead of two appraisers, and the realtor talking with his hands, showing them the view as if he were already hosting. His smile was taut, the kind you get from holding a pose too long. Across the street, Jonas's pickup idled nose in to the curb, a rolled blueprint fat as a loaf on the dash. He lifted 2 fingers off the wheel in a barely there salute. I tucked my scarf closer and waited where the porch floor had the least give the spot I'd marked with my heel last week. The bell on the breakwater sounded thin in the cold. Morning, Calder said, voice bright enough to fog the air. He spread a page from his folder against a porch post, the paper's corners lifting in the wind. "We'll just need inside access for—" "We won't," I said, and took the wind-ruffled burden from him with 2 flat sheets of my own. "Town attorney asked to be present." I nodded past his shoulder. The attorney was already halfway up the steps, hat brim pinned by his free hand, briefcase angled like ballast. Ruth, the realtor, smiled professionally at no one. "Let's get out of the breeze," she suggested, but the porch felt right. If you're going to turn a table, better to do it where the legs are honest. I put the first document on the rail, a purchase and sale agreement dated 2 weeks prior, signatures walking the line in ink. Notary seal pressed crisp and pale like a winter sun. The second was an invoice, edges still smelling faintly of printer heat, roof repairs, temporary weatherproofing, tarps, fasteners, work completed and paid. The appraisers stopped moving like a flock that had seen a shadow. Calder laughed lightly, the sound half cough. "What is this?" he said, but his eyes were already reading ahead of his mouth. The attorney took the contract, checked page numbers, the way a man checks pulse, then compared the property description to a folded town map he'd taken from his case. His nod was small and deliberate, as if approving a bridge weight. "Executed and notarized," he said. "Seller and buyer satisfied. Recording scheduled this afternoon." Ruth's clipboard softened against her coat as she exhaled. A strand of hair escaped her bun and found her cheek. "Then I suppose," she said, not looking at Calder, "our work here is done." The appraisers exchanged a glance that said they had other porches to stand on. Calder's color went somewhere warm and didn't send a forwarding address. He looked at the invoice in my other hand as if it were a joke told too soon. "You've already done work?" "Emergency stabilization," I said. "We had wind last week." I tapped the bottom line. "Paid in full. Contractor's affidavits in the packet if you'd like to read while you warm up." He stared at the attorney, then at Ruth, as if either might remember a different ending. The attorney closed his case with a click that sounded like a door deciding something. Jonas's truck engine cut across the street. I could feel the silence that followed more than hear it. Timing Calder managed. The word used to fit his mouth. Today it scraped. Agreed, I said. I uncapped my pen, the click sharp in the cold, and signed the acknowledgement the attorney slid my way. The nib hesitated a fraction on the first letter like a foot testing ice, then moved cleanly through my name. My hand steadied itself against the rail. Beneath it the wood felt firm grain raised a little from the damp, a surface honest about weather and work. Ruth offered Calder a graceful exit. "We can regroup at the office," she murmured, and he seemed to hear the word office as a lifeline in a language he still spoke. He gathered his folder slowly, sheets tapping into alignment that didn't align anything. I opened the door, the latch answering with the dry certainty of a well-cut mortise. "I'll see you at the registry," the attorney said to me and tipped his hat. "Appreciate it," I said. The bell out on the breakwater counted another measure. I stepped inside and held the door just long enough for the wind to press against it like a palm, then let it close. The glass pane trembled and settled. Through it I watched Calder remain on the porch, a beat too long, staring at the clapboards and the windows, and the roofline at the place itself, as if the house had turned on him mid-sentence. He looked like a man waiting for a building to apologize. Town Hall smelled like varnish and burnt coffee, the kind that sits on a hot plate until it forgets what beans are. Folding chairs had been set in cautious rows, and a box fan in the corner pushed warm air around with a mechanical sigh. On the far wall, zoning maps perched on easels, broad swaths of pastel with heavy black lines, showing where imagination hoped to live. Celeste sat in the front row, sensible shoes planted a thick manila envelope on her lap, like a sleeping cat. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. Calder was already working the room handshakes and shoulder squeezes. His laugh set a click too loud. When the council chair tapped the gavel, he flowed to the podium with the easy grace of a man who has practiced in mirrors. Rockport deserves a harbor front that reflects its potential. He began, palms open, voice honeyed. Revitalization, jobs, access. We're talking about a small adjustment to the zoning that will unlock value for everyone. He gestured toward the maps. A corner of one lifted under the fan's breath and curled back like a tongue. Right now, he continued, small, underutilized parcels are preventing coherent development. A modest consolidation, voluntary market-based, would allow us to build amenities families will use. Think boardwalk, think public seating, think improved lighting and safety. This can be shovel-ready by summer if we act now. I could see his knuckles whiten on the edge of the podium when he said voluntary, as if the word might try to escape. My name never crossed his lips, but our house-shaped omission stood in the middle of his sentences like a missing tooth. When he finished, several heads nodded. A pen tapped a steady little metronome on the dais. The chair thanked him and opened the floor. Celeste rose without the small cough people use to ask permission. She carried her envelope to the microphone, set it down, and unbuttoned it with the neatness of a seamstress. "I'm Celeste Rowan," she said. "Main Street 40 years. I build, I restore, I pay taxes, and I read public records for fun." A low murmur scattered like birds. She pulled out copies, neatly clipped stacks, and handed them to the clerk, who began walking them up to the council. "Before you vote to redraw our town to fit a pitch, I suggest you look at the financials of the loudest voice in the room." Calder's smile did not move. Only the muscles around it remembered how. He tried to speak, but the chair lifted a palm and asked him to wait. Celeste kept her tone pleasant, but each sentence set a nail. "What you have are liens on 2 charter vessels recorded last October and March, a UCC filing from a regional lender, and 2 letters declining additional credit. Those stamped dates are important, you'll see." You'll also see a conditional offer on a Victorian on Wharf Lane being used as collateral in some conversations. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. A counselor with half glasses slid a page closer. Mr. Finn, are these accurate Calder's charm recalibrated? My business, like many, took a hit during COVID. We're rebounding. These documents show temporary measures. As for consolidation, why the rush? Another counselor asked a woman who kept her hair in a pencil-thin bun that meant business. Every letter here is within 6 months. Your plan leans on a property you don't own. It's in process, he said, and the word sounded smaller than it had on porches. This is about Rockport's future. The fan thumped. The zoning map's corner flipped back again, exposing a little white triangle of wall. I thought of the watch in my pocket, and of the way cracks announced themselves, faint at first, then true. Celeste lifted one more sheet. I would also note, she said, that parcel 17B, the house in question, has grandfathered docking rights documented in prior deeds. Changing setbacks and access language here would have the effect of devaluing what that deed protects. If the council intends to invite litigation, this is the fastest road I know. Silence isn't really silence in a room like that. It's the sound of people rereading of a pen, stopping mid-tap of the gavel, staying politely asleep. The chair cleared his throat. Thank you, Ms. Rowan. Mr. Finn, anything further? Calder leaned too hard on the podium, then remembered not to. Rockport needs growth, he said. We can't let a single holdout dictate the shoreline. Or a single developer, the pencil-bun counselor said. The chair conferred with his neighbor in a small whisper that didn't travel. Then he straightened. We will vote on whether to move the rezoning proposal forward to planning for full review, he said, as if the outcome hadn't already begun to form in the air. Hands rose. 1 yes, 2 no, 3 no. The chair counted aloud, the numbers clean and unadorned. Motion fails. The noise that followed wasn't a cheer. Rockport is not that kind of place. It was chairs shifting, someone letting out a breath they'd held too long, the box fan wobbling once on its stand. Celeste gathered her envelope and returned to her seat without looking left or right. When she sat, she allowed herself a small exhale and the kind of smile you give a beam that finally takes weight. I moved into the aisle. Calder stepped away from the podium and cut a line toward the exit, fast enough to look like purpose, slow enough to pass for dignity. As he brushed by me, the air around him smelled like cologne and cold fury. This isn't over, he muttered. Not quite to me, not quite to himself. I know, I said, and stepped aside so he could go on imagining a door, where a wall had just introduced itself. The varnish smell deepened as the room warmed. The maps rustled on their easels like sails that had decided for now to stay furled. The first swing of the hammer sounded bigger than it had any right to, one clean strike that ran along the studs and came back to me like a heartbeat. Dust lifted from the lath in a pale sigh. Spring light pooled on the floor where we'd pulled up carpet. Through dusty panes, the sea was a dull coin flashing only when a gull cut across it. Jonas whistled from the ladder. Trim's coming off easier than I feared, he said, easing a length of casing free, as if he were untying a knot. Paint flecks salted his hair. My knuckles had their own confetti of white proof that old layers surrender a little at a time and in no particular order. From the porch came the clatter of teenagers learning how to carry lumber without arguing about who was strongest. Ellie's voice rode above them, amused and firm. She came in with a roll of butcher paper tucked under her arm and the smell of school chalk clinging to her sweater. I want to hang sketches here, she said, unrolling a draft gallery wall along the longest stretch of plaster and put shared tools there. If you teach them how to use a level, they'll never forget you. Levels are merciless teachers, I said. That's why they're fair. Outside, a compressor coughed and settled. The siding crew's air nailers began their tidy syllables, and somewhere near the eaves, a plank creaked, the way a ship does when it remembers it was once a tree. We had opened the main room to the bones, and found the house wasn't embarrassed by its age. It stood there, ribs out, willing to be made useful again. Celeste arrived the way weather does no drama, but suddenly the temperature of the room knew her. She had a bakery box and a canvas tote. She sat both on the sawhorse and surveyed the open space, chin high, eyes bright. "You kept the crown," she said, pleased. "Good. People like a little dignity with their new." She opened the bakery box muffins heavy with blueberries, the tops sugared to a shine. "For the crew," she said, and handed me one as if I'd earned it. Then she walked the room with that contractor's gait she never lost, towing thresholds, palming newel posts, reading surfaces with her hands. "You'll want a display case," she decided, pointing to the wall opposite the bay window, exactly where the light softened in late afternoon. "Something meaningful needs a place to start." I knew what she meant before she did. I reached into my jacket and felt the small ache waiting there. The pocket watch had been riding with me every day, cracked face, stubborn tick, a reminder and a dare. The fracture line caught the light like a river on a map. "I'm taking it to Bram's today," I said. "Think he can fix it in time?" "Bram fixed a ship's chronometer with a butter knife and a prayer in 1989, Celeste said. "He'll manage glass." She handed me a second muffin for the road, and a look that said more than baked goods ever could. Ellie shooed 2 teenagers toward the sawhorses. "Measure twice," she said, "argue 0. They laughed, edged the board into place, and for once the cut sang true the first time. The scent of fresh-cut pine lifted into the room and made everything feel possible. Jonas slid the new casing where the old had been and stepped back. The fit was so clean it looked inevitable. On my way to Bram's, I stopped in the doorway and turned around. The house was a mess, the right kind of mess, wires tagged with blue tape, stacks of reclaimed heart pine ready for sanding, a bucket of brushes in a row, like a platoon at rest. A draft skated across the floor and worried a corner of Ellie's butcher paper. Her sketches fluttered and settled, visions practicing how to be walls. Bram's shop smelled like oil and watches that had been telling stories longer than I'd been alive. He peered through his loop at the crack in the crystal, hummed as if he recognized the tune. "Clean break," he said. "No shards skating loose. Better than new, just you wait." His hands moved without hurry, the kind of confidence you only get from years of being right in slow ways. Back at the house, the afternoon leaned toward gold. We hung the new porch light. Ellie chalked a schedule on a sheet of plywood sanding paint shelves, opening day circled with a star. Celeste appeared again with a thermos and poured coffee that tasted like patience. "Remember, she said, this place belongs to everyone who walks in and decides to help. You just happened to be the first one who did." We worked until the compressor coughed itself quiet. The teens left in twos, their laughter spilling down the steps, like bright nails leaving small echoes behind them. Jonas locked the tool chest, stretched his back, and grinned at the room as if it had nodded back. Ellie gathered her sketches with the care of someone folding another person's shirt. When they were gone, I washed the paint off my hands at the deep sink and stood at the bay window. Across the narrow side yard, my parents' house sat with its curtains drawn, the porch swing still. No candle lit the kitchen, no clink of plates. Evening tugged the color out of the hydrangeas until they were only shapes. The bell on the breakwater spoke once and carried. I pressed my palm to the glass and watched my breath fog and fade the way plans do when they meet the weather, and I wondered if the door next door would open when the banner went up, or if the house would keep its counsel and let the tide answer for it. By 9, the yard was already alive, footsteps in the gravel, voices overlapping like a tide that wouldn't go out. The banner stretched between the porch posts snapped in the harbor breeze. Harbor House. Community workshop in deep blue paint. Ellie had insisted on mixing herself. Jonas was crouched by the steps, fussing with an extension cord, while Ellie arranged folding chairs in arcs, her hair pulled back and speckled with sawdust from the morning's last-minute sanding. Celeste moved through the crowd with the easy grace of someone who'd lived every chapter of this street. She shook hands, accepted hugs, and somehow kept her white linen blouse spotless despite the drift of grilled seafood scents curling in from the side yard. A cluster of teenagers, their Harbor House t-shirts still stiff from the printer, ferried potluck dishes to the long tables, paper plates, bending under potato salad and blueberry cobbler foil crinkling in the sun. I stood at the top of the steps, the wood still holding the faint warmth from its final coat of varnish, and looked out at faces I'd known since I could count birthdays on one hand. Somewhere in the middle row there was an empty chair, front and center. Its absence was as deliberate as the podium beside it. When the chatter dipped, I cleared my throat. A couple of years ago, this house was headed for the same kind of quiet that swallows so many places when no one sees their worth, and I began my voice steadier than I'd expected. We've all passed buildings like that, peeling paint shutters, hanging stories leaking out between the clapboards. This one could have gone that way too. But it didn't. I told them about the work crews and the teenagers who learned to frame a doorway, straight about Ellie's idea for art classes, about Jonas finding the hidden strength in old beams. We didn't just fix a house, I said. We built a place where work and welcome can share the same roof. Celeste stepped forward, then carrying something small wrapped in a square of deep green cloth. She paused at the new display case along the bay window. The crowd leaned in the way people do when they sense the hinge of a story. She folded back the cloth and sunlight caught on polished glass. The pocket watch, its crystal whole again, the brass rim gleaming like it had been waiting for this morning. She set it inside, closed the case, and let her fingers rest for a moment on the wood. A ripple of applause ran through the yard, quick and warm. I let it wash over me, scanning the crowd almost without meaning to. At the edge, half in the shade of the maple, stood my mother. Martha's hair was pinned back, and she wore the same light jacket she'd had on the porch the night she told me to leave. Her hands were clasped, her eyes on the watch. When they lifted to meet mine, it was only for a heartbeat, but something in the set of her mouth softened. She shifted as if to step forward, then stopped the toe of her shoe, tracing a half moon in the grass. Jonas called for everyone to come inside to see the workrooms and the new shelves. People filed past me through the wide doorway, the air inside touched with the mingled scents of fresh paint and coffee. Flags strung along the porch rail snapped in the wind. Someone laughed loud enough to make the floorboards hum. When the last of the crowd had moved in, I followed. The room was bright, the case standing near the wall exactly where Celeste had imagined it a year ago. I opened the top and placed a framed photo beside the watch, my family at the harbor years before, all of us squinting into the sun, shoulders nearly touching. The watch caught the light and held it steady on the glass of the frame. "I'm still here," I whispered, not to the watch, not to the photo, but to the air that carried the smell of salt and muffins and sawdust. Outside, the harbor bells chimed and the sound slipped in through the open windows, easy as breathing. That afternoon, sunlight poured through the workshop windows, glinting off the watch's smooth, mended glass. I stood there a while, listening to the hum of voices in the next room, the scent of fresh paint still clinging to the walls. It struck me that sometimes justice isn't loud. It's a quiet place you can return to even after the bridges you counted on have burned. Homes can be rebuilt. So can trust, though it often takes longer. For anyone weathering loss or change, know that new beginnings often hide in plain sight. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise?